and respect right here in the temple. So I think we can begin. May I begin our introduction, my introduction of our presenters tonight? I think I can begin that.
Yes.
I think I used this introduction a previous time when John and Desiree made a. They've done a couple of wonderful presentations at the congregation over the years. Well, John was born in England and he's made Florida his home for the last 40 years. And after a long business career, he's devoting his retirement to telling the story of the Holocaust and making sure that next generations never forget. In one of his previous presentations, A Jewish Family in Berlin, 1770 to 1944, 5 generations, he tells the story of the Holocaust through his own family. He continued his exploration of the Holocaust, showing how the hatred of the Jews was so widespread in almost every country in Europe. Now, Desiree was born in South Africa and is a retired physician, having worked in the Hallandale, Aventura area for over 40 years. And she's spending her retirement being on call, not to her patients, but to her grandchildren. And she's working with John on this very important project. And so tonight we commemorate the 83rd anniversary of Kristallnacht, November the 10th, 1938. We remember the savagery and the hate all over Germany. And their talk is entitled, "Why Did More Jews Survive in Some Countries Than in Others?" So I'm going to hand it over now to John and Desiree.
Desi, she's handing over to you.
Thank you, Rabbi, and for the introduction, and thank you to both you and to Cantomani for honoring us with giving the slot for the study class tonight. We commemorate Kristallnacht, the anniversary, and we see on this slide on the left the tall, proud towers of the synagogue in Berlin, and on the right we see the destruction, the glass shards on the ground, not to mention the desecration of the Ark and the Torahs. And so I'm going to read to you in commemoration an account written by John's cousin, Martha, who was in Berlin on this fateful, horrific night. And she wrote this letter to her son in England, begging him, beseeching him to get his 11-year-old younger sister out of Berlin. "I will never forget the St. Bartholomew night as long as I live. The banging and thunder-like crashing and shouting was unbelievable. It destroyed something deep inside of me. It destroyed my belief in humanity. We live among savages, my boy. One saw people unmasked, base and mean, enjoying the destruction. I can't get rid of the feeling that this was done on order. We are not allowing the children to go to school until Monday because the churning Volksseele, that's the soul of the people, could flare up again. And this is just the beginning. Therefore, I beg you at least to save your sister before it is too late. If the conscience of the world does not wake up soon, we are lost. We are not even safe in our homes. The child was so shook up today that she cried bitterly. It hurt my innermost soul, believe me. And for all this, your father carries his wooden arm, and the hand he lost in World War I wore the iron ring with the inscription from the Germans, the fatherland's thanks. Mercifully, the son was able to get his 11-year-old sister out of Berlin. She was transported in the Kindertransport in March 1939. 4 months later, her name was Anne Fox. she became a journalist. She wrote prolifically about the Holocaust. Sadly, as in so many cases, she never saw her parents again. And here's a picture that we'll talk about a little more, the title of our talk, How More Jews Survived in Some Countries Than in Others. And in researching why survival rates varied so much from country to country, and in looking more deeply into the reasons, we came up with some very real surprises. Survival rates vary from a low of 5% in Lithuania and 10% in Poland to astonishing 80% survival in Italy, although Mussolini was a close ally of Hitler. In Holland, we have a positive attitude, mainly because of Anne Frank. We recall in her diary how for so long her whole family was hidden by a righteous Dutch family. Yet, only 25% survived. Yet in neighboring Belgium, 40% survived. France, though occupied by the Germans and under close supervision in the south in Vichy, 70% survived. And these surprises, as we read on, were the inspiration for this talk. And we also look at the moral dilemmas of ordinary people caught up in the Holocaust. So we're going to trace this thread of two important reasons as we go through the different countries that explain the different reasons. And two of the most important are, one, the more hatred of the Jews that pre-existed before the Nazis invaded, the more collaboration and the more Jews were murdered, as we will see in Poland and Lithuania. And the second reason is in countries ruled directly from Berlin, persecution of the Jews was more strictly enforced and survival rates were much lower. For example, Holland, Poland, Lithuania, and Ukraine. And we will look at Holland. In countries which were allowed to remain semi-autonomous and local leaders had some freedom to avoid deportations, more Jews survived. For example, Hungary till 1944, Bulgaria, Italy, Denmark, and we will look later at Italy and Hungary till 1944.
So the obvious place to start is in Poland. Why in Poland? Well, Poland had a population in 1933 of 34 million, and the Jewish population was considerable, 3.3 million, 10% of the total population, and the Jewish survival rate was only 10%. So Poland was the epicenter of the Holocaust. Why? Well, 50% of the 6 million Jews murdered were Polish. Some of the most important concentration camps, Auschwitz, Birkenau, Treblinka, were located in Poland. And the most famous ghettos in Warsaw and Lodz were also in Poland. Now, Poland is a controversial, touchy subject. You see, the Poles see themselves as victims of the Nazis. The Jews see the Poles as the worst perpetrators, collaborating anti-Semites and Nazi sympathizers. And what we'll try to do in this talk is understand both sides and present a balanced view. Now let's give you the Polish point of view. So Poland for centuries had been a victim, divided up by other countries such as Russia, Germany, and Austria-Hungary. Poland was the victim of the most vicious and ferocious attack in September 1939 that brought the Allies into the war and was the start of World War II. Just imagine, 1.5 million German soldiers poured into Poland, supported by 2,000 airplanes, severely damaging Warsaw and other cities. Now the Germans, it has been revealed, had a written plan, the Ostplan, a plan for the East. And their plan was to eliminate all the Poles and Polish culture before annexing Poland to Germany. Let's remember that 2 million non-Jewish Poles, soldiers, political opponents, and so forth, were killed by the Germans. And 2 million Poles were deported as slave labor to Germany. The Nazis considered Poles and Slavs in general as an inferior race. And here's a picture of Poland divided up into two: on the left, the German part in blue, and on the right, the part that was taken by the Russians. And this was a pact between Hitler and Stalin. So the German plan for Poland was swiftly executed. 500,000 Germans were resettled in Poland, displacing the Poles. Thousands of Polish intellectuals, and particularly priests, were murdered, and 250,000 Polish political prisoners and undesirables were shipped to Auschwitz, and only half survived. The Germans even kidnapped Aryan-looking Polish children, snatched them from their parents, and transported them to Germany. As far as the Jews were concerned, the Poles were encouraged to start pogroms targeting the Jews. And the Jews were rounded up into newly created ghettos. Let's talk for a minute about the ghettos. So the Germans established as many as 1,000 ghettos all over Poland. And the plan was to create a Jewish quarter, making roundups and eventual deportation and mass murder easier. In fact, even in the smallest villages where there were a few Jews, they put barbed wire out just to cordon off the Jews and keep them trapped. Now, the Warsaw Ghetto was, of course, the largest ghetto. 400,000 Jews, or 30% of Warsaw's population, were crammed into an area of 2% of Warsaw. The number of people per room was over 7. July 1942, the deportation of 300,000 Jews to Treblinka began. In April 1943, there was the famous ghetto uprising, the final elimination of the ghetto, and it was set on fire. Now let's give you the Jewish point of view. It's quite different, of course, from the Polish point of view. Jews returning after the war, everyone seemed to say the Poles were the worst Jew haters of all, and this was going back centuries. Poland, it must be remembered, was a Catholic country, and this led to traditional Jewish hatred, religious Jewish hatred. And the Poles started hundreds of pogroms. Poles greedily seized Jewish property. Polish resistance even refused to help the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. And Jews who were returning after surviving the Holocaust, when they came back home to Poland to reclaim their property, they were terrorized by the Poles. Poland has since then made restitution in claiming back stolen assets almost legally impossible. Now, the Poles are very, very sensitive. And in 2012, President Obama was pressured to apologize for saying Polish death camps instead of German concentration camps in Poland. Some Polish historians try to make their suffering equivalent to the Jewish suffering. But it's difficult to make an equivalency, but let's look at the percentages. So 2 million Poles were murdered out of 34 million total population, representing 6%. 3 million Jews were murdered out of 3.3 million, 90%. And now we're going to show you clips from the movie Shoah. Some of you may have seen this movie, but you'll see how important it is. So it was made in 1985. It's 9 hours long. We're not going to show you the 9 hours. It took 11 years to produce, and it interviews survivors, perpetrators, and bystanders while the Holocaust was still fresh in their minds. And it's more than a documentary. It's an overwhelming witness to the Holocaust. Now, the movie clips you're about to see, that interviews take place in small Polish villages near Kelmo. Kelmo was a concentration camp located 30 miles north of Lodz. Kelmo was the first camp to use gas to kill the Jews in 1941. And before the gas chambers were perfected, the Germans experimented with gas vans, large trucks that had sealed compartments in the rear and could hold up to 80 people at one time. And then deadly carbon monoxide from the engine was pumped back into the sealed rear. Trucks were driven slowly around, taking 20 minutes to kill the victims, and the bodies were dumped in pits in the forest. And here's a picture of that dreaded gas van.
Das war das ganze Dorf. Sehr kleines Dorf. Zog sich an der Straße lang und waren nur ein paar Häuser da. Nur vorne ist eben die Kirche, das Schloss, und ein Laden war da, und das Amtsgebäude und die Schule. Ja, Schloss und Kirche, das war fast zusammen. Konnte man nicht unterscheiden, weil der hohe Zaun da drum war.
Ja. Ihre Wohnung war wie viele Meter von die Kirche?
Gegenüber. 50 Meter.
Haben Sie diese Vergasungswagen gesehen?
Nein. Von außen ja, die fuhren ja immer vorbei über die Straße. Aber
Ja.
reingesehen habe ich ja nie. Ich habe nie einen Juden drin gesehen. Ich habe nur das Äußere gesehen, wie sie ankamen und wie sie verfrachtet wurden. Wie sie aufstiegen, habe ich sie gesehen.
Polacy que les Juifs étaient très belles. Les Polonais aimaient beaucoup faire l'amour avec les Juifs.
Et les femmes polonaises sont contentes qu'il n'y ait plus de femmes juives maintenant? Qu'est-ce qu'elle dit?
Non, elle dit que les femmes qui ont maintenant le même âge qu'elle
Oui.
aimaient aussi faire l'amour. Voilà.
Et alors, les femmes juives, c'était une concurrence?
Też to była konkurencja troszkę, czy nie? Les Polonais aimaient les petites juives, c'est fou ce qu'ils les aimaient.
Et les Polonais regrettent les petites juives?
Także myśli pani, że ci Polacy żałują, że już nie ma tych Żydóweczek? Bien sûr, les femmes si belles, bien sûr.
Et pourquoi, en quoi étaient-elles si belles?
Dlaczego były takie ładne?
Nie tylko Polacy, nie tylko Żydzi, bo tam Polacy są. Dzieci są. Wszystko samochodami woziły.
Alors, elles étaient belles parce qu'elles ne faisaient rien, les Polonaises, elles travaillaient, et les Juifs, elles ne faisaient rien, seulement elles pensaient à leur beauté, elles s'habillaient bien.
Ah, les femmes juives, elles ne travaillaient pas.
Także Żydówki raczej nie pracowały, tak? Elles ne faisaient rien du tout.
Pourquoi ça?
Dlaczego nie pracowały?
Miały dobrobyt.
Elles étaient riches. Elles étaient riches et les Polonais devaient les servir et travailler.
J'ai entendu le mot capital, elle a dit.
Il y avait le capital qui était...
Ah oui, ça, tu n'as pas traduit. Repose-lui la question à madame. Le capital était donc entre les mains des Juifs.
Znaczy kapitał był raczej w rękach żydowskich, tak? Toute la Pologne était dans les mains des Juifs.
Et est-ce qu'ils sont contents qu'il n'y ait plus de Juifs ici ou tristes?
Czy raczej uważa pan, że to dobrze, że już Żydów nie ma, czy raczej, że nie?
Żydów nie ma. No wie pani, nam nie przeszkadzały. Były, no w ogóle można powiedzieć, że jak wiadomo państwu, że Żydzi mieli cały przemysł w Polsce przed wojną, tylko Żydzi i Niemcy.
Ça ne les dérangeait pas de toute façon, mais comme vous savez, toute l'industrie en Pologne avant la guerre était entre les mains des Juifs et des Allemands.
Mais est-ce qu'il les trouvait sympathiques dans l'ensemble?
W ogóle raczej byli sympatyczni, ludzie uważali, że dało się z nimi żyć.
No raczej, że były wredne dla nas.
Pour les Polonais, ils n'étaient pas très...
No.
Et surtout, ils étaient malhonnêtes.
Et ils étaient malhonnêtes. Est-ce que la vie était plus gaie à Grabouf quand il y avait des Juifs que maintenant?
Myśli pan, że tutaj życie w Grabowie było troszkę weselsze, jak ci Żydzi byli, czy teraz jest weselej?
Z tym to nie można za dużo mówić.
On peut en parler.
Je ne sais pas. Pourquoi est-ce qu'il dit qu'ils étaient malhonnêtes?
A dlaczego byli nieuczciwi? Dlaczego?
Proszę?
Co to znaczy, że byli nieuczciwi?
Żydzi?
Tak.
No bo oni, że można powiedzieć, żyli na wyzysku Polaka najwięcej. Na wyzyskie walki.
Ils exploitaient les Polonais, c'est ça qu'ils vivaient surtout.
Comment est-ce qu'ils les exploitaient?
A co to znaczy wyzysk w tym wypadku?
No można powiedzieć, każdy zawód najbogatsze były Żydy, a Polaka ciągli cenę taką, jaką oni chcieli, jaką żądali. Dlatego była to, można powiedzieć, nie wyzysk.
Ils imposaient leur prix.
Hmm? This in the 70s and 80s, I think.
Est-ce qu'il y avait autant de juifs dans l'église qu'il y a eu de chrétiens aujourd'hui?
Wtedy, kiedy Żydzi tutaj byli w kościele, to było ich tyle w kościele, co dzisiaj katolików. Było, bref.
Il fallait combien de camions à gaz pour vider tout ça?
Ile trzeba było ciężarówek tych gazowych, żeby opróżnić kościół?
Trzeba mieć 50 trzeba mieć, przeciętnie 50.
50 en moyenne.
Il fallait 50 camions pour vider tout ça. C'était un trafic incessant.
To znaczy ciągle samochody podjeżdżały i odjeżdżały bez przerwy, tak? Oui.
Madame disait tout à l'heure que dans la maison d'en face, c'était là qu'on entreposait les valises des juifs.
Pani powiedziała, że te żydowskie bagaże potem były w domu vis-à-vis, tak?
Qu'est-ce qu'il y avait dans ces bagages?
Co było w tych bagażach? Pieniądze. Parfois, il y avait des casseroles à double fond.
Qu'est-ce qu'il y avait dans les casseroles à double fond? Le double fond des casseroles.
I co było w tych garnkach o podwójnym dnie?
Wartościowa
Il y avait des objets précieux, qui avaient une valeur. Oui, il y avait aussi de l'or dans les vêtements. Et quand on leur donnait à manger, puis les Juifs leur jetaient parfois des objets précieux, parfois de l'argent.
Et ils ont dit tout à l'heure qu'ils ne pouvaient pas parler aux juifs, que c'était interdit.
Powiedzieli Państwo, że nie można się w ogóle było odzywać do tych Żydów, ale czy usiłowali Państwo jakoś ich... C'est absolument interdit.
Je demande leur est-ce qu'ils regrettent les juifs?
Czy żałują Państwo tutaj tych Żydów? Żałowali ich Państwo? Żałują Państwo ich? Żałowali ich Państwo? Nous avons pleuré tout comme eux, dit madame.
Ja im chleb i ogórki nosiłem.
Et monsieur Katorowski leur donnait de la nourriture, du pain et des concombres.
Demande-leur à leur avis pourquoi toute cette histoire est arrivée aux juifs.
A jak się Państwu zdaje, dlaczego to wszystko spotkało akurat Żydów?
Ils byli najbogatsi.
Parce qu'ils étaient les plus riches.
So I hope you thought as much as I did of that short version from Shoah. And I'm sure some of you may have comments about it. And we ask you please to keep them to the end. But just to remind you of what you just saw. In the first scene, you saw the Nazi teacher's wife who saw the gas fans, but claimed she didn't really know what was happening, although she'd lived directly across from the church, the scene of the 50 gas fans emptying the church of the Jews that we saw in the third clip. And in the second scene, you saw a gathering of middle-aged Polish women reminiscing about the Jews. And note how cleverly the interviewer relaxes them by small, innocent questions and leads them to reveal their true feelings. And in the third scene, outside the church, people remember those 50 gas vans that loaded perhaps 4,000 Jews, 80 per van, to a rapid, painful death. They knew about the vans, but they seemed somewhat detached about it. But they also recall, as you heard, that the Jews ran the country, were rich, and exploited the Poles. And this movie keeps alive in its raw footage the reality of perpetrators, bystanders, and victims. And as in 1985, they still remembered the Holocaust firsthand. Most of these people, like the survivors, are no longer living.
I'm going to tell you about an incident that happened in Poland that shows the tremendous hatred of the Jews, and this can only be titled Savagery Unleashed. In the course of one day in 1941, the Poles of the small village of Jedwabne, spurred on by the German invasion into Russia, killed all the Jewish inhabitants. Half of the population were Jewish, and they'd been living peacefully with their neighbors for centuries. And the unthinkable savagery that included murdering 1,250 Jews and also included burning of 1,000 Jews alive in a barn. 66 similar pogroms to Yad Wavni occurred simultaneously in the same area. And we heard how Rabbi Tufts in the introduction spoke about a survivor who was in East Prussia and was subjected to Kristallnacht. This terrible incident of mass murder was kept a dark secret by the villagers and only came to light in the year 2000, 60 years after the event, by the research of a historian, Jan Gross, who documented this in a magnificent book, magnificently written and researched book called Neighbors. And in our previous talk, Europe Against the Jews, we tried to understand how this savagery could happen. And we understand from historians and researchers that ordinary people become savages in times of war. The moral compass shifts and they swept up in crowd hysteria. And in this case, in Yad Wavni, we see when Nazi racial ideology met long-standing Polish hatred of the Jews, violence erupted and killing took place.
So some final thoughts about Poland and the Jews. If you think of it, the Jews were never really recognized as real Poles by the Poles themselves. They dressed and appeared very different, and most Jews spoke only Yiddish, not Polish. Poles themselves had an exaggerated impression of Jewish influence and wrongly thought that the Jews ran the country, as we saw in the movie. The Jews represented 10% of the total population and 30% of Warsaw's population, a significant number, making them more noticeable and a threat. Compare this to other Western European countries where Jewish population was often less than 1%. Most Poles thought you had to be a Catholic to be really Polish. And politically, the Jews were regarded as enemies of Poland. Why? And traitors. They preferred the Russians to the Germans. And there was a common saying among the Jews, it's better to rot in a Russian jail than to die in a German concentration camp. The Poles were later thrilled when the Nazis invaded the Russian part of Poland. Poles in the Russian sector feared that they would be swallowed up by the Russians. To be fair, there are many inspiring stories of Poles helping Jews. And in fact, there were 7,000 righteous Poles recognized by Yad Vashem, more than any other country. Just one fact, 25,000 Jews were hidden in Warsaw outside the ghetto by Poles. And it's estimated that it took 75,000 Poles to hide them. You see, the Jews had to keep moving. So for every Jew hidden, there were 3 Poles who had to hide them. But in reality, the number of righteous Poles represents a very small percentage, and most Poles were bystanders or perpetrators. Unfortunately, the hatred of the Jews continues in Poland today. Just a few months ago, in 2021, in August, Poland passed a new law making restitution for the Jews impossible, and Israel withdrew its ambassador in protest. Here's a picture of the Poles greeting Hitler. This is in the Baltic port of Danzig. Okay. And it shows you the flags and how enthusiastic they were. Now, this is an incredible picture. This is a picture of German soldiers boarding a train. And on the side, if you see on the left, is written, handwritten, "We're going to Poland to smash the Jews." We mentioned earlier that the Nazis abducted Aryan-looking children, and here's some of the children that were taken back to Germany. And here's a picture, an execution of non-Jewish Poles by the Nazis. Here's a picture that went round the world in a flash and moved millions. It's a picture of a Polish girl. If you look on the ground, you see her sister, who's just been shot by an aircraft and is dead. And look at the despair, and she rushes to the photographer for comfort. Here's a picture of the infamous blue police who hunted the Jews. And here's a very famous picture of a little boy with his hands up, and you see the German soldiers guarding the people in the ghetto. And here's a picture of the Warsaw Ghetto on fire and the poor people running God knows where.
We're going to move on to Lithuania, and my personal connection to Lithuania is that all four of my grandparents left Lithuania at the turn of the 20th century and came to South Africa. And they fled from the pogroms of Eastern Europe and Russia. So if we go through the population and the statistics, the population in 1933 was 2.25 million, 10% of the were Jewish, 225,000, and the Jewish survival, the lowest of all in Europe, 5%. And we know that Lithuania was the center of Jewish culture and learning, and Vilna, the capital alone, had 100 synagogues. Vilna was known as the Jerusalem of the East. And the elimination of the Lithuanian Jews was done with unparalleled speed and efficiency. Over the course of 6 months, from June to December 1941, 175,000 of the 225,000 Jews, of 78%, were murdered. And the Lithuanian hatred of the Jews was legendary. And we're going to trace this hatred that goes back for so long, and we show it in the brutality of the next two slides. This was an eyewitness account of a German soldier in Kaunas, Lithuania in 1941 as he passed a gas station. It became known as the Lietuvos massacre, where 3,800 Jews were murdered in the course of 5 days. And I'm going to read this horrific account. I saw a crowd gathered and heard the occasional shouts of bravo. Mothers raised their children on their shoulders so they could get a better view. I saw a muscular 25-year-old blonde man with a club in his hand, with 15 to 20 people lying at his feet, either dead or dying. A hose was washing the blood down a nearby drain. Behind the man were about 20 men quietly waiting their gruesome execution in silent submission, guarded by civilians. And the crowd kept cheering. And afterwards, the man stood on the pile of bodies in triumph, playing an accordion while the crowd sang the Lithuanian national anthem. And this is the graphic horror of what was just read. And this was an account by a German soldier. We see the bodies, we see the hoses washing down the blood, and we see the rapt spectators as though they are being entertained by a spectator sport.
So that's very moving. So we've looked at Jewish survival in Poland and Lithuania, and tragically, so few Jews survived in either country. The world saw for the first time two things: the might of Hitler's army in the invasion of Poland and the speed and force of blitzkrieg, war at lightning speed. Secondly, the true meaning of the final solution, as 175,000 Lithuanian Jews were so rapidly destroyed in a few months, 78%. And now we move on to three countries with very different survival rates. And we try to understand, as we do in this talk, the reasons for these different survival rates. And the three countries are Italy, Holland, and Hungary. And we're going to start with Italy. And the population of Italy in 1933 was 15 million. The number of Jews was 48,000. This was tiny. This was, the percentage of the total population was 1/3 of 1%. But truly astonishing is that 80% of the Jews in Italy survived. And we ask ourselves, why did this happen? And here are some of the reasons. So the Jews had been in Italy for 2,000 years, since Roman times. They were well liked, with less anti-Semitism than in any other European country. Though in some centuries, the Jews had been persecuted. In fact, the word ghetto is an Italian word. The Jews were very assimilated, culturally, politically, economically. And the Sephardic Jews related well to the Italians. 50% of the Jews intermarried, and the Jews were largely indistinguishable from the Italians. So as we've said, Jewish population was rather small. And this made the Jews more of a curiosity in Italy rather than a threat, as in Poland, which had 10% Jewish population. Politically, the Jews were loyal Italians, and a number even joined the fascist party. Mussolini himself did not share the Nazi hatred of the Jews, and he was rather embarrassed by it. He delayed deportations and other persecutory measures. He even had a Jewish mistress, Margarita Sarfati. There were also very few Eastern European Jews in Italy, which in other countries aroused suspicion. And there was little friction with the Catholic Church, since the assimilated Jews were not particularly religious. So let's just follow Italy during the war. So in 1938, Mussolini, under increased pressure from Berlin, passed many laws persecuting the Jews, but never enforced them. During the war in Rome, the police protected the 10,000 Jews living there, and 90% survived. Concentration camps were opened, but no Jews were deported till 1943, when the Germans took control of Italy. Goebbels had complained that the Italians were not serious about the final solution. But as the war progressed, Mussolini grew increasingly unpopular. The Italian army was defeated in North Africa, and Germany seemed to be losing the war. In 1943, Germany, frustrated by the Italians, took over Italy, sending in 800,000 troops. And now serious persecution of the Jews began. 8,600 Jews were deported to Auschwitz, including that well-known person, Primo Levi. Only 1,000 survived. The Jews in Italy were saved because in 1943, the Allied army invaded Sicily. Mussolini was deposed. The Italians surrendered. Just to sum up Italy in some thoughts. So Italians generally protected the Jews, and so did their leader. However, as we will see in Holland, there was a balance of good and bad. And we saw Italians protecting the Jews, yet undoubtedly some Italians were opportunists and collaborators, as in so many countries. Italy was full of contradictions. One could be a loyal fascist, yet oppose racism. The masses adored Mussolini, but rejected his later persecution of the Jews. And Italy was Hitler's ally, and yet rejected the final solution. And the Catholics, who in earlier times had burned the Jews, now gave sanctuary, although the Pope, to put it mildly, was not very helpful. The Italians in their newly conquered countries, Yugoslavia, Greece, and France, protected the Jews. And a good example of this is when the savage Croats attacked the Serbian Jews, the Italians protected them. And the Jews gratefully nicknamed Serbia the Promised Land. In Italy, unlike most European nations, the good outweighed the bad. Here's a picture of Mussolini riding with Hitler in a car. Here's Mussolini being adored by millions of supporters. Here's a picture of the Italian clergy giving the Heil Hitler salute. And here's the future Pope, Pius XII, signing a pact with the Nazis, which he later regretted as his worst decision. Yeah, it's a worst decision. Here's a very famous righteous Italian. His name was Gino Bartali, and Gino was the cycling champion of Italy many times over, but in his spare time, he gave messages and saved many Jews.
We move now to Holland, population of 8.4 million, just under 2%, 156,000 Jews. And as we mentioned, the surprise, that's only 25% survive. As we mentioned, we have this knowledge of famous Anne Frank's diary, which tells of the righteous people hiding the Jews. And yet this high percentage, 75% of Jews murdered, tells a different story. And yet 40% in neighboring Belgium survive, but only 25% of Holland. And we're going to trace that thread of being ruled directly from Berlin that we said at the beginning, the hatred of the Jews and the rule directly from Berlin. So Holland before the war had a long tradition of welcoming the Jews, going back to 1492 when the Jews were expelled from Spain, from the Spanish Inquisition, and they fled to Holland, where in Amsterdam, they were so assimilated and acculturated, they were often indistinguishable from fellow Dutch, just as the Italians that John mentioned under Italy. In Antwerp, traditional Jews, in fact, dominated the diamond trade, and they had full civic rights and felt very much at home. But wartime changed things. In May 1940, Holland invaded, and there was a quick surrender to the Germans in a few short days. Queen Wilhelmina and the Dutch government fled to London. For a year, Holland was left largely alone, and many prospered from war contracts. And Hitler, considering the Dutch Aryans, actually liked them. So many thought life under the Germans was not too bad. But the Nazi plan did something different, that the Jews would be rounded up and deported, all Jews, create a Jewish council and central office for Jewish immigration, euphemized as resettlement. But we know that that was a ruse to deport to death camps, mainly to Mauthausen from Holland. And we know how the Jews really believed that they would be resettled, and we'll see some pictures in a moment. The other thing that the Germans did, the Nazis did for Holland, was to mandate identity cards, which asked for religion to be noted. And Holland, here's the key, would be governed directly from Berlin and treated as part of Germany. But at first, these steps didn't seem that threatening or sinister, because everyone, including the Jews, had to have an ID card with their religion on it. But the Germans executed their plan, and the Dutch see the reality. In 1941, the roundup of the Jews began in earnest. The Dutch were horrified by the deportation of 400 young Jews to Mauthausen, which now is widely known as a death camp. There was a spontaneous general strike that broke out all over Holland, but it was brutally suppressed in 3 days. The fury of the Nazis was unleashed, parliament suspended, new Nazi leaders installed by seasoned anti-Semites. And here, between 1942 and 1943, a time span of about a year, 115,000 of the 156,000, 74% of the Jews in Holland were deported with amazing speed and ruthless efficiency. And how could this be done so quickly? Well, identity cards and the large concentration of Jews in major cities made them easily identifiable. There was the cooperation of the Dutch police and the civil service, though there was some conflict. The Dutch had always had good relations with the Jews before the war and were actually shocked when ordered to start the roundups. They even saw desperate Jews throwing themselves out of apartment windows or gassing themselves rather than report to the fatal railway station. And though police attempted to delay deportations, it was ineffectual. And this is one of the keys that a historian wrote, that bureaucracy is the true villain of the Holocaust. And the Dutch civil service, accustomed to following orders, now worked closely with the Germans. And though they naively thought they could change the Germans by working with them, it was to no avail. And 25,000 Dutch now volunteered for the SS through a mixture of surprising anti-Semitism and opportunism. It was estimated there were as many as 10% of the Dutch who collaborated. And after the war, 56,000 prosecutions took place for working with the enemy. And then there were the bounty hunters, a special force of 400 volunteers who roamed Holland for several years looking for Jews, paid a daily salary and a hefty bonus for capture. It's estimated that 7,000 Jews were killed this way. And then, unlike other countries of Eastern Europe where there were forests, the flat landscape of Holland made hiding difficult. There was the presence of 30,000 Jewish refugees, German Jewish refugees in Holland who were not Dutch citizens. And the Dutch felt less loyalty to stateless people whom they handed over more freely. The same treatment of stateless Jews occurred in Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, and France. And just as a personal aside here about John's family, they were amongst those German Jewish refugees who fled to Holland thinking that Holland was neutral, never believing that within a short time they would be deported to the concentration camps. And here, by summary, Before the war, the Jews were fully integrated into Dutch society with full civil rights and welcome. The German invasion shocked the Dutch, who were initially angry at the deportations, and a general strike did show resistance that was quickly quelled. The Nazi invasion and quick Dutch capitulation caused widespread confusion, but they really stood no chance against the organized Nazi killing machine. And so the reality is that while on the one hand, many Jews were helped by locals to go into hiding, to balance it, we need to acknowledge there was active collaboration and groups of Dutch who hunted the Jews down. And then we saw the key Holland ruled directly from Berlin by seasoned fanatical Nazis, whereas contrasting Belgium under military rule, which was less strict, allowed Jews to organize resistance. 1.40% of the Jews in Belgium were in hiding. And they also allowed a committee to defend the Jews in Belgium that saved thousands of lives. So we see this contrast with a higher survival rate in Belgium. This is a picture of the general strike with brutal termination in 3 days. This is the final transport from Westerbork to Auschwitz. This is the picture that we saw at the beginning of the slide. Westerbork was a transit camp where Jews were kept until they could be deported. And in the first year when we spoke about how many were deported, 1942 to 1943, they were shipped to Auschwitz, deported to Auschwitz. Later, in 1943 to 44, they subsequently were deported to Theresienstadt and Bergen-Belsen, where some of them survived. And this is the train schedule. It's a little tight and a little detailed, but we see here the dates, the year, the number of Jews, and to which camp they were sent. And right at the bottom, 13 September 1944, that was where John's family, 5 of them, were shipped to Bergen-Belsen. We spoke about the ruse of resettlement, and we look at the proud Jewish people, well-dressed, 2 Jewish families with the stars, proudly walking to the deportation, not having any idea what's about to happen to them. We see their suitcases, they were allowed to take a small amount of possessions. Such a tragic slide, knowing what's about to happen to them. And here's Queen Wilhelmina addressing the Dutch nation. And this, of course, is the famous picture of Anne Frank, the middle home on the left, where the family was hidden, now a tourist attraction where over 1 million visitors come each year. And this is an unusual hiding place that the Dutch had. It is a rural area where it looks pretty unremarkable and unobtrusive, but this was a kind of a trapdoor where Jews were allowed down to hide underground. Dutch collaborators after the war being arrested.
And now, after Holland, we move to perhaps the most tragic country of all, Hungary in 1940. Let's just review Hungary first. So the population of Hungary in 1940 was about 15 million. There was a large Jewish population, 725,000, which represented about 5%. Survival rate was 31%. Now, the destruction of 434,000 Jews in 1944 at the end of the war is both perplexing and tragic. You see, the world leaders already knew about Auschwitz and did nothing to stop the trains. The Germans already knew the war was lost, yet the mass extermination went ahead with breakneck speed, masterminded by Adolf Eichmann. Let's just review the Hungarian timeline. So the Hungarians, like several nations, were depressed by the loss of World War I, and the Great Depression made Jews the scapegoats, as in many countries, for the worsening economy. In the 1920s, anti-Semitism escalated, and there was the founding of the dreaded Arrow Cross, a paramilitary group that when you talk to Hungarian Jews, they shudder. In 1938, laws were passed persecuting the Jews, but not enforced. You see, Hungary had joined the Axis, but the Germans left Hungary alone as a quasi-autonomous government, and the president, Miklos Horthy, delayed deportations, protecting the Jews. But by 1943, Hungary, sensing the Germans were losing the war, began secret talks with the Allies to make peace. And the Germans, in 1944, distrustful of Hungary, poured troops in and took over, and the systematic deportations began, carried out, as we shall see, almost entirely by enthusiastic Hungarians. So the total elimination of Hungarian Jews was averted by the looming defeat of Germany. So let's just break down these 55 days when 434,000 Jews were deported to Auschwitz. Oh, it's almost incredible to think about it. Half of the Jews left in Europe were killed. That breaks down to 8,000 a day, 60% of the Hungarian Jews, 80% were immediately gassed on arrival, 147 train journeys between Hungary and Auschwitz. You must remember, we'll show you the map on the next slide, Auschwitz was only 200 miles from Budapest. And all this was masterminded by Adolf Eichmann and carried out almost entirely by the Hungarian police, bureaucrats, railway workers, and enthusiastic volunteers. And they even built a new railway line directly to Auschwitz, almost to the doors of the ovens. Here's a picture that will help you understand what happened. So on the right, you see in this sort of orangey color, that's Poland. And just below, and there's Auschwitz, right at the southern tip of Poland. Then you have Slovakia, very small country, and then you have Hungary. And on the left, this is to me amazing, is all the gathering points, all the transit that they were set up by the Germans, so organized prior to deporting the Hungarian Jews to Germany and Auschwitz. In the first 4.5 years of the war, Hungary, with 725,000 Jews, had been an island of safety in an ocean of destruction. However, in March 1944, the nightmare began. And in no other country was the final solution carried out so swiftly and methodically. Churchill commented in his history, it was probably the most horrible crime committed in the history of the world. But miraculously, 250,000 Jews in Budapest were saved. In July 1944, President Horthy stopped deportations, and many people think his main motivation was fear of reprisals from the advancing Allied armies. You should also remember the Swedish diplomat Raoul Wallenberg, who issued thousands of passports to desperate Jews. In reality, what saved the Jews was the invasion of the Red Army and the defeat of Germany. And here's a happy picture. Here's a picture of Hungarian Jews before the war at a swimming party. Here's a picture of Miklos Horthy riding with Hitler. Here are the Hungarian Jews lined up for selection at Auschwitz. We all remember left or right, life or death. Here's a picture that I find particularly touching of Hungarian children being deported. Here's a synagogue in Budapest being used as a warehouse. And here are women being arrested in Budapest on their way to being shipped to Auschwitz. And here's a particularly sad picture. It's of mostly women and children waiting in a grove, not knowing that they were near oven number 4 in Auschwitz. And they were only waiting because the ovens were, they had to wait for their turn to be gassed. Here's a picture on the left of the Jews lining up to the Swedish embassy, and on the right, the righteous Gentile Raoul Wallenberg. Here's a picture in 2017 of the Hungarian Prime Minister on the left apologizing to Prime Minister Netanyahu.
This is a memorial along the Danube River in Budapest, which I saw when I was there some years ago. And it is a most moving memorial of sculpted shoes. And it's called 60 Pairs of Shoes, memorializing 60 Jews who were executed at that site. They were told to take off their shoes, face the river, shot in the back, and fell into the Danube. One of the most moving memorials I've seen.
So few Germans and so many willing helpers. Now, in Hungary, Eichmann had only, amazingly enough, 150 Germans helping him murder millions, and the Hungarians did the rest. And it's remarkable how few actual Germans it took to murder so many. It's estimated that Reinhard Heydrich, the main architect of the final solution, had the enthusiastic support of 300,000 non-Germans. Those were Ukrainians, Latvians, Lithuanians, Hungarians, Estonians, Romanians, Croats, and so on and so on. Really was Europe against the Jews. And their reputation for cruelty, when you read about it, was legendary, especially the Latvians and the Lithuanians.
So our concluding thoughts are now here. And the two very important reasons we spoke about and carried the thread through the different countries for varying survivals were the more hatred of the Jews before the Nazis invaded, the more were murdered, as in Poland and Lithuania. In countries ruled directly from Berlin, persecution of the Jews was more strictly enforced and survival rates were much lower, as in Holland that we saw and Hungary after 1944.
But the real decisive factor was the effectiveness of the Nazi killing machine. German efficiency was used to a terrible end, and euphemisms were used to hide the horror. The Jews were described as pieces, the number of victims as production units, and the plan for genocide was called the final solution. Mass murder was so organized that rounding up the Jews, transporting them, then killing them was done with extraordinary speed, iron will, and a fixed purpose. Assembly line murder was done on an industrialized scale. By 1944, most of the Jews in Europe were dead. The remainder were only saved by the defeat of Germany by the Allies. And in occupied France, amazingly, over 70% survived, largely because the Germans ran out of time. Just think of it. In Hungary, Eichmann murdered 434,000 Jews in 8 weeks. No doubt the French Jews were next.
And so we've seen that the Holocaust is really a very complex story, a mixture of complicity and compassion, acts of kindness and acts of horror, where perpetrators could also be victims. And as we talk about the complexity and the moral dilemma, we're going to end with a story of Aaron Elster, a little boy born in 1933 in Poland, the son of a Jewish butcher. After the Nazis invaded, he, his father, his parents, and sister were murdered in 1942. He and another surviving sister were hidden by a Christian family on their farm, and they had been customers of his father. However, the mother of the rescuing family quickly regretted her decision to hide the Jews. They were then treated with a mixture of contempt and neglect. And Aaron stated, "I was grateful for them, but I was afraid of them, constantly demeaning and threatening us." So how do we make sense of this morally conflicted family, as with other conflicted people? And this family who was their savior and also emotionally abused them. And this was the dilemma of so many ordinary people. And we've spoken to Rabbi Tufts at a previous stage about how we need to look really, really honestly into our hearts and into our souls and ask ourselves what we could have done in these terribly dangerous times before we condemn the people who stood by, did nothing, were morally conflicted. We ask ourselves, what would we have done, could have done, if we or our families and our families were threatened? And we leave you on this note with thoughts of the complexity as well as some contradictions.
And this is the bibliography. And really, that's the end of our talk. And we're going to hand it over now to Rabbi Tufts and invite any comments and questions, and we'd be happy to answer.
You know, it was an incredible presentation. Thank you so much. This was such an interesting analysis of what transpired during those horrible years. It's historians will talk about different reasons for the Second World War, and those who try and see why the Germans went eastward. The word in German Lebensraum comes up again and again. They wanted living space, right? I mean, you hear this. This was, I think, in essence, the Second World War was, in essence, a war against the Jews. It was like no other war ever committed. Hannah Arendt wrote that she said that, war is about killing. We know that. But when a country simply wants the territory of another country or some resource of a neighboring country, they will kill people until that nation surrenders. The killing stops when people surrender. In the case of the Second World War, the killing really began in earnest when the countries that Germany invaded surrendered. It was in that it was not like any other war. It was a war against the Jews. I think this is something that's not understood by most people. So I'm going to put it out there for questions. I'm sure we have some questions. Who do I see? Let's see. Just raise your hand if you have a question. Unmute yourself if you have a question, and put your hand up. Oh, Marilyn, Adani, and Mordechai. Okay, and I can't see Sheila and Aaron and Joan and Paula, so you're going to just have to unmute
I think
yourself.
Ruth is raising her hand, Rabbi.
Oh, Ruth, go ahead, Ruth. I didn't see you there. Sorry.
Okay, thank you for that wonderful presentation. That was really thorough, and your details are terrific. I have 3 questions, but I'll ask the first. What happened to your family, John? And when were you affected directly? What happened? Did you go to concentration camp? What happened?
No, my grandfather was saved, and so was my father. And the reason was that my father emigrated to England in 1924. So he really didn't see the Holocaust firsthand, but the rest of his family, they all died. But my branch of the family, and he got out my grandfather in 1939, right at the last minute, because he was a British subject. So that really, but the rest of the family wiped out.
And were the Jews in Poland citizens? Were they allowed to be citizens?
Yes. Well, they were, but if you see the pictures, you ever seen Vishniak's, portrayal of Europe with the ghettos? You can see the difference. They were very separated from the Poles, and if you look at the rest of the movie Shoah, you see how the Jews, even in these little villages, had their own little shtetls, and they were separate. They were very, very separate, and then many of them didn't even speak Polish.